Oh, there's an Anne Bronte too? I did not know there was three. What the
That was the
hell?
whole point of the podcast.
I literally did not even put two and two together that there was three sisters. Oh my gosh. Okay.
Girl, that's why I read from Anne, so that we had one from each.
Listen, okay. I've had a lot going on.
No, you're good. Literarily. Hello, and welcome to Like Literarily. I am Rylee from Rylee Tries Hobbies, and my house is being worked on, so please excuse the construction sounds.
I'm Alysha.
And I am Alexis, or better known as Momo, and I run Momo's Bookshelf, and this is episode 9.
Woo! All right, so we're taking it back a little bit and going back to the 1800s, similar to, A Christmas Carol vibes. We're going to go over a different classic novel from each of us, and they're all written by the Brontë Sisters, who you might have read a book or two from in high school. What fun English lit classes. We're also carrying on with our theme of women's lit. We've only read one book written by a man, so go us. And it was A Christmas Carol. Also, spoiler warning, these books are like super old, so if you care about spoiling these for yourselves, this episode's not for you. Anyway, all right, Alexis, want to start us off with your book?
Yes, absolutely. So I technically reread Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, one of the apparent three sisters. And it was actually one of my favorite classic books. So instead of rereading it, like the physical copy, I actually listened to the audiobook. I actually ended up listening to two audiobooks. I listened to majority of the one on Spotify, like through Spotify Premium, and then I finished listening to it on Hoopla because I had a book club where the only place that I could read that book was on Spotify. So I didn't want to run out of hours. I did follow along occasionally with my, like, I think it's like a mock first edition type copy. So if that shows you the level of commitment that I have. um, what did you guys read?
So I listened to Agnes Grey by Anne Bronte. She's like the least known of the sisters, which makes sense because Alexis, you didn't know she existed, but that's okay. Justice for Anne. It's a largely autobiographical book written by at least the least known sister Anne. It's a good short audiobook. It was only like 5.5 hours long, and it was free on Audible. So thanks, Amazon. It was pleasant, but I have no strong feelings about this book. I also never read anything by the Bronte sisters. Well, I attempted to. I attempted to read Wuthering Heights when I was young and pretentious, and I never finished it. Because it was slow AF. But that's okay. Alysha, tell me about yours.
Hold on. I just learned groundbreaking information. I never knew it was pronounced Agnes instead of Ames.
Oh my God.
There was an Animal Crossing character, a little cow named Ames. I thought it was Ames.
It's Agnes.
Agnes.
I just want to make the side note. I promise all of us are smart. We're all very highly educated women.
Alysha's the most educated out of all of us. So.
I can't pronounce things, and
no, you can't. You really can't.
Come to terms with. So,
Alysha is the Schmidt of like literarily.
I'm trying my best. So I also technically did a reread. I read Jane Eyre by Charlotte. I read this in high school as well. It was forced. It was not because I was trying to be cool like some other people on this podcast.
We've gone over that I was pretentious in high school. It's really fine. I was a pick-me. It is what it is. I can admit it.
We're all just accepting our character flaws today. I did listen to this as an audiobook instead of rereading it because while we were all choosing our books to read for this episode, I did not know Jane Eyre was a 24-hour long book.
Lol.
Womp, womp, womp. So I listened to it at 1.75 speed. We did the thing. I have learned audiobooks are not really my thing. I think I mentioned last month that with the memoirs, it's like a vibe. It's not a vibe for me for the fiction books. It was a no-go. Um, but it is what it is. Let's summarize these books so our readers know what we read.
Well, first we
Rylee,
need
kick
to
us
know the
off.
history of the Brontë sisters,
Okay,
guys, and
okay.
why we picked them. Come on,
Oh,
Alysha.
okay. Go
All
ahead and
right.
educate us.
On today's history lesson for Like Literarily, I wanted to give a bit of the history of them because they are pretty interesting. Charlotte, Emily, and Anne Brontë were poets and novelists who published under male pen names. After an extremely underwhelming response of their joint book of poetry, they only sold 3 copies. This was in 1846. They published that and sold, again, 3 copies. They all got the motivation to write their own novels that were all published in 1847, and they coincidentally happened to be the 3 books that we read: Jane Eyre, Agnes Grey, and Wuthering Heights. Crazy. They only wrote 7 novels among them. However, many of those are now considered classics of English literature. Their history starts with the Brontes being a large family with 8 people living in a small row house in Yorkshire, England, in the village of Thornton. And they were very religious. This comes out in their books. They were educated at home, and both both Charlotte and Anne grew to be governesses in multiple homes, and Emily served as a teacher. The sisters dreamed of one day opening a school for young ladies, but that never came to fruition. One day, Charlotte found Emily's poems on her desk, and after a quarrel, the 3 sisters collaborated on that book of poetry under the surnames Kerr, Ellis, and Action Bell because they sounded manly. After selling those 3 copies of their poetry books, let's see, they all basically sat around and consulted each other on their novels. And thus Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and Agnes Grey were born in 1847. Their writing careers did not last long, however, well, at least for 2 of the sisters, because Emily and Anne both died of tuberculosis between December 1848 and May 1849.
That's so tragic.
I know. Sorry to laugh, but I just see you guys on the Zoom cracking up, and it's cracking me up. Sorry, this is
Rylee and I had already gone over this information, but Alexis was just receiving it real time.
Yeah, you guys are getting live action responses.
So, like, if you care about Hank Green, tuberculosis takes over everything in history, and this is another one. Anyway. So those 2 sisters died of tuberculosis. They were 29 and 30 at their deaths. And then Charlotte survived for at least a little bit while longer, because when she was 38, she died due to pregnancy complications.
Jeez, this is tragic.
It's awful. Anyway. Famous books.
Here's us slightly depressing everybody today.
At least we're laughing while we're doing it. Does that make it better? The nervous laughter? I don't know. But famous books by Charlotte in order of publication are Jane Eyre, Shirley, Villette, I don't know how to pronounce that, sorry guys, and The Professor. And then Emily wrote Wuthering Heights. And then Anne wrote Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Winterfell Hall, which is more popular of her books. However, it was also a really freaking long audiobook, and I did my research before picking them, unlike Alysha.
Good job. Proud of you.
Thank you.
So maybe now I should summarize my book.
Yeah, you could do that now. Sorry, I thought they had an interesting history and wanted our listeners to know about it.
Well, that explains why Wuthering Heights was so depressing.
Well, some of these themes pop up in Jane Eyre. So let's go through the summary of Jane Eyre.
So chipper.
Thank you. So the novel begins. Oh, hold on. Before I read this off, I did not write this. This is from BBC. It was a 24-hour book. You weren't going to get an efficient or effective summary from me and me alone. And so we're going to rely upon others. All right, so the novel begins with Jane living at her aunt's, Mrs. Reed. Mrs. Reed and her children are very cruel towards Jane, and one night Mrs. Reed locks Jane into the, quote, red room, a supposedly haunted room in the family home. Mrs. Reed sends Jane to Lowood School, where the headmaster, Mr. Brocklehurst, is also cruel towards Jane. Conditions are very poor at the school, and Jane's best friend, Helen Burns, dies of consumption. Jane later becomes a teacher at Lowood. Jane applies for a governess position at Thornfield Hall and gets the post. She becomes governess for Adele, a young child. Jane begins to fall in love with her employer, Mr. Rochester. A fire breaks out at Thornfield, his property, his house, nearly killing Rochester as he sleeps. Jane saves him. Rochester claims it was started the fire by a servant. However, Jane doesn't think this was true. Jane is shocked when Rochester confesses his love and desire to marry her. She thought he wanted to marry somebody else. And so on the day of their wedding, though, a man turns up at the church to declare that Rochester cannot marry as he is already married. Rochester reveals all about his marriage, claiming his wife Bertha is mad and he wants to be with Jane. Jane cannot be with Rochester when he is still married, so she runs away, becoming homeless and then sick. The Rivers family takes her in and nurses her back to health. Jane inherits her uncle's wealth and estate. She finds out that the family that took her in are actually her cousins. St. John, which was pronounced as like St. John in the entire audiobook and drove me insane. That may be the correct pronunciation, but I refuse. St. John Rivers asked Jane to join him in a missionary work abroad, but in order to do this, she must become his wife. She nearly accepts, but when she hears Rochester calling her in a dream, she decides she cannot marry someone who she does not love. So Jane returns to Thornfield, and when she arrives, she discovers it has been burnt down, and Rochester is now living at Ferndean, his usual retreat, and is blind. Jane rushes to him, and they marry. The novel concludes with Jane and Rochester married with children. Rochester also regains his sight in one eye.
So what did you actually think about it after that long of an audiobook? Because, geez, that's a lot.
That was a long summary. I can only imagine the audiobook. Damn.
Well, it's like so many things happen. That's why I was like, I don't know how to summarize this succinctly. That was like the 8 bullet point list of like the things. And it completely breezes over how manipulative Rochester is during the entire book, which is largely what I disliked and what drove me nuts. I mean, this book, as far as like the characters go, was like not good. The book itself, I enjoyed. And so that's a weird distinction to make, and I'll get into that a little later on. But I also think, like I said, this was a reread for me technically. So like I don't think I was a huge fan reading it the first time around. And I think there's video evidence of this somewhere.
Yes, there is. I have seen it. It is a masterpiece. Truly a masterpiece. It defines my college experience.
Share it to our Instagram for our followers.
I mean, well, one, it's like 15 to 20 minutes, and two, I don't know where it is because we burned it on a legitimate DVD to watch it in class.
Wow, way to age yourself.
You guys brought the DVD so I could watch it. You all sat me around a computer and had me watch your freaking project. All right, you need to explain this project, Alysha.
So we were in AP Literature in high school, and we had to read Jane Eyre. And there was a couple different, very artistic projects we could do to prove pretty much that we had read Jane Eyre. And one of the options on this list was that you could remake a movie of this novel. And so our little team of like 5 or 6 people decided we're going to make a movie of Jane Eyre. We found out when we told the teacher this is what we would be doing, that we were the first group to ever choose to do this. And we were told after the entire class had to sit through our 15 to 20 minute movie that we would be the last group able to do this. I think it was pretty clear at the time that Rochester was extremely manipulative, and that Jane was just very naive, and it's just like rough to get through the book with the characters. Jane's very gullible, but like at the same time, she's met like 4 men in her entire life before she like falls in love with Rochester. And those men before Rochester were just like straight up terrible. So like it would make sense she meets a guy who at least like gives her a passing interest, engages with her in conversation, and she's like, I'm in love. Like, fine, I guess it makes sense for like her context, but like having to read the book and have Rochester just like manipulate and somewhat gaslight her throughout it. He like disguises himself to try to figure out if Jane likes him. He's constantly like lying that he's going to marry this other person. All of this going on while he is legitimately already married to another person. Tries to tell Jane, like, no, I don't want you to be my mistress, even though I'm already married, but I still want to get married to you. And she's like, well, isn't that like the definition of a mistress? And he's like, no. And so like it's cool that she does like stand up for herself in like all these scenarios. And throughout the book, she does end up like doing everything on her own terms, but it just feels very manipulated. Like it feels like it's still gullible, even though she's like coming to these decisions seemingly like on her own, just due to like lack of experience. And you're like, girl, you could get a much better man. I would assume this was the 1800s. This book took place in the early 1800s. I don't know what the dating pool looked like then.
What this tells me is, here's my one cuss word for this episode: men ain't shit since minimum 1847.
1847. Yeah, their whole
Minimum.
relationship was toxic. So when we're thinking about toxic relationships, I think we got a book for that.
That was a great segue. That leads me right to Wuthering Heights and its entire synopsis. If you want short version of Wuthering Heights, everybody is toxic and then everybody dies. The
Lol.
longer the longer version. So actually, fun fact, I believe Wuthering Heights was written also in 1847. Basically, like the perspective of the book was written from this guy who shows up named Lockwood, and he's like, yeah, I'm gonna come rent this house or a room in this house, and it's at Thrushcross Grange, and it's like in like the country part of England. So when he gets there, he meets like this older version of Heathcliff, which is toxic number one of this book. And he was like, yeah, this dude's kind of weird. Well, then he ends up meeting this housekeeper. Her name was Miss Dean. And he's like, yeah, like, what's up with this guy? And she's like, oh, I got stories for you. So she like launches into this story about Heathcliff and then this other like property called Wuthering Heights and this like crazy story. And while she's talking, because I guess she was a servant when she was a girl, and then she like became the housekeeper as an adult at Wuthering Heights. The guy who owned the house originally was Mr. Earnshaw. And when he comes back, he brings this orphan guy, and that's Heathcliff as a kid. And he's like, yeah, I'm gonna like raise this guy with the rest of my kids. Well, Hindley and Catherine, those are another two important set of characters, are raised with Heathcliff is raised with them, and pretty much like from a young age, Heathcliff and Catherine are like as in love as you can. You know, like those like childhood stories where it's like we've met when we were like 5, and I feel like we've like always been in love. It's like one of those things, right? And then Hindley like hates Heathcliff because their dad like prefers Heathcliff to him, and he's crappy about that. So he dips to college and he keeps Heathcliff nearby, the dad. Well, then fast forward, they end up meeting the original owners of Thrushcross Grange, and that's the parents of Edgar and Isabella Linton, and they're like kind of snobby or whatever. And like all these things kind of happen, and she's like recounting all these stories about how Catherine and Heathcliff are like the best of friends, and she's the only one that treats him well. So he like has kind of like, you know, not to make like a Harry Potter reference, like, but like think like Snape and Lily kind of thing. And then pretty much one summer comes when they're a little bit older. Catherine goes and hangs out with the Lintons, and when she comes back, she's like, actually, I really, really think like Edgar's cute. I'm gonna hang out with him. And he goes like, whoa. And so pretty much fast forward, I think I kind of lost track listening to the audiobook, especially because I was listening to it while I was working, that like Heathcliff runs away at one point. Catherine gets married to Edgar, sorry. Somebody dies. I think Hindley comes back at one point. He's married, but then his wife dies, having a kid. And then pretty much when Hindley dies, because the dad didn't really care about Hindley, Heathcliff actually inherits the manor where they were living. He gets, he's like, all right, cool. Well, the complications between everybody's relationship, especially Heathcliff and Catherine's, because everybody in this book is toxic. He's like, I'm gonna marry Edgar's sister, who married Catherine, and which is Isabella, and I'm gonna treat her like crap, but I'm gonna marry her because now I'm gonna also get Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, because back in the 1800s, property went to men. So he finessed everybody. He did not care. Then Catherine dies after giving birth, and now he's even more annoying because he's like super pissed because he's like, you knocked Catherine up and killed her. And now he just really takes it out on everybody. Somehow, by the end, Heathcliff was in charge of everybody's kids. Don't know why they trusted this man. Literally the most toxic of this entire book. They give him his kid. They give them his kid. Somehow he ends up with them. I think at one point his wife dipped with his kid, but then he still ended up with his kid back.
Girl, I like read the synopsis of this book and I was like, what is happening? I mean, I think I like picked up, I think it's like told in a lot of flashbacks, like they're talking
Yeah, it's a lot of
like
flashbacks.
renting this property, but I was like, this is chaos.
Pretty much when Catherine decides that her infatuation and her priority of like social standing, because remember, Heathcliff was an orphan and technically he didn't have anything, and I think they assumed that Hindley, the brother, would like take the manor and like be left all this stuff from Mr. Earnshaw, but like there was a plot twist. So she ends up actually getting feelings for him again because like now Heathcliff has something to his name, basically. I mean, she was a gold digger for real. And she basically chose like, you could fake a lot of things, but not a rent check. So that's why she went and married the Edgar Linton guy. But then he could finesse everybody. He treated everybody like crap. Everybody was scared of him. And he finessed the literal crap out of everybody and ended up being the owner of both of those properties, the Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights. I mean, I commend him. I mean, he made it work. He finessed everybody. He said
he was into a long game.
He really was. He was Saltburn. That was Heathcliff. Okay, like
oh my god,
like that was him for real. And then then he ends up forcing somebody's kid who fell in love with somebody else's kid. I can't even remember. I'm not gonna lie who it was, to come and be a servant. And then essentially, I think when he gets like super sick, Kathy and Hareton end up getting married, and I think Hareton was Hindley's kid and Kathy is somebody else's kid. Listen, like I could not even keep track.
There's too many characters. And then
some of them had the same name because they were all obsessed with each other and everybody was toxic.
This is too much. I'm glad I put this down and never picked it back up ever again. I never will.
At the end of the day, if anybody thinks that toxic relationships are more obvious now, they need to come read Wuthering Heights. It's existed. It was just less recorded because we didn't have social media. Could you imagine if they all had Instagram?
She would have been messy. Oh, sorry. That was my one bad word. No!
But yeah, so that is essentially Heathcliff as told by Momo. I mean, not Heathcliff, Wuthering Heights as told by Momo.
Snaps. I don't know if it's coming through the audio, but I appreciated the theatrics with that.
Also, the audiobooks were only entertaining because they have an accent, and I love British accents, as we know. But they were pretty long. Like, one was 11 hours and one was 13. So definitely not the 24 that Alysha had to endure, but still pretty long.
Was it narrated by a woman or a man?
Both that I ended up listening to were narrated by women. The Spotify narration was better than the Hoopla one. For sure. Cool. I like when I made the switch, I was like, oh god, this is tough.
I like how I'm asking these questions like I'm gonna listen to it. Absolutely not. All right.
So,
Are you
I'm
ready to talk
ready.
about Agnes Grey? Not what
Yes.
the hell did you say, Alysha?
Ings.
Eggs.
I'm gonna go stand in the
Eggs.
corner.
All right. Well, social standing definitely came up with in Agnes Grey. However, it was like not nearly as dark as y'all's. Um, it is believed this book is very autobiographical since there are many parallels between Anne and Agnes. The book follows Agnes Grey, a governess.
I would like to interrupt to say she changed like one letter in her name. So
I mean, yeah, two letters. She added yes. Anywho, as she works with in families of the English gentry, since Anne was also a governess, this is one of the parallels. And then also it includes like the relationship between Agnes and her sister, and then strong religious morals, and ends up including the Brontë sisters' dream of starting a school. And spoiler alert, Anne finds love or Agnes finds love at the end, which like I could only assume is what Anne wanted in life. It like ended in like the happy ending that she wanted for her and her sisters. Overall, the book just kind of talks about Agnes. It's like in first person. It's kind of like similar to A Christmas Carol, where she like breaks the fourth wall sometimes and just tells the reader like commentary about stuff. But it's kind of written like a letter to your BFF being like, yo, these kids that I'm watching and trying to teach things to suck. Also, the mom sucks. Also, the dad sucks. Oh, now I'm gonna go work for a different family and they suck too. So that's like most of the book is her just like talking about being a governess, and then her like complaining about it, and then some of her other relationships within the book. And then eventually she falls in love with like the preacher, and originally the preacher is in love with like one of her students. The student says no to the proposal of like the preacher, and he's like heartbroken. And then Agnes and the preacher like start talking, and then she leaves the like family and starts to school with her mom after her dad dies. And then the preacher ends up being the preacher at the town next door and has her dog for some reason from like the government when she was governessing, whatever the inging is for that word. And then they live happily ever after. And that is Agnes Grey. And yeah. And it's kind of just sad knowing that that's probably how she wanted her life to end up, and instead she died of tuberculosis.
Rip. Dang. So in synopsis, or in summary, Alysha's book is everybody is naive and men are not shit. Then in Wuthering Heights, it's everybody is toxic. And then in, what is it? Agnes Grey, everybody sucks.
Yeah, everybody sucks. Well, they didn't all die. She found true love at the end.
In real life.
A happy ending. Oh yeah, in real life, everybody died.
That's so sad. They all died literally before 40. Emily Bronte was my age when she died. That's terrible.
Well, Emily was 30, and then Anne was 29. So we were the same age as Anne.
Yeah. Dang.
Poor thing. Yeah. But it really wasn't that bad. I don't know. It was really short, thank God. It was only like 6 hours long, and I could listen to it at one point like 5 speed, fine. It was fine. But I'm pretty sure it's on the public domain. You could definitely read this book for free on Kindle if you wanted to.
I think the 70 years have lapsed.
That is also true. It was fine.
There's definitely like reoccurring, like Rylee, you said that you found online, like they collaborated on these books.
They collaborated a lot. And like social standing definitely came up in all of these.
Which makes sense at that time. Like when you were getting married, like you were marrying off your daughters for like a step up in society. So that makes sense.
Yeah, that was obviously like a large topic in Jane Eyre, because like Jane's an orphan, like doesn't have any money. She's like, how am I going to make a living? And then like not wanting to necessarily marry to get that money meant she was like very counterculture, and like how was she going to survive? And that's why she's like pursuing these governess positions. But then she comes to money right before she marries Rochester. How convenient that she can then make this decision without being influenced by his social standing. This money just comes out of like nowhere in this book. But it is what it is.
The Brontë sisters were all dreamers.
I guess, yeah, maybe there was a small aspect in each of them. The other one that definitely seems the other like reoccurring thread is definitely religion. Jane in Jane Eyre is very much like very driven by her moral compass and is like constantly just doing selfless acts and is like, I serve everybody else around me. And that's how I like make my decisions and like what I'm doing, even though when I was an orphan child at the girls' school, they were telling me I was like the devil reincarnated because I was a liar and deceitful for like no reason. There's like the religious tones were
Yeah. And
constant.
Agnes Grey, it's the same way. She like every time her like students come to ask her, like, oh my God, the guy I married sucks. She's always like, follow God. And she says
I
that
don't,
a lot. So it's pretty
I don't,
constant.
I don't remember hearing a lot about God. Like I know he was referenced in Wuthering Heights, I'm sure. Um, but I know that like it was more so maybe not necessarily like religion, but just like the concept of like, oh, if you marry Edgar, you should because he's like got more money and like social standing, and you would be more of like a respected lady of society or whatever. So I guess like probably sort of the same concept because that's where a lot of those principles came from. But also to add on to the toxicity of Wuthering Heights, Kathy was the daughter of Catherine and Edgar Linton, and Harrington is the son of Henley and Isabella, so they were definitely cousins and got married. So that's
I
Cool.
can't say that incest came up in Agnes Grey,
It
but
did
that is
come up.
interesting.
It came up in Jane Eyre.
Ah!
Her cousin tried to marry her, so he didn't love like not because he wanted to go on the missions trip. And she was like, "Can't we just go as siblings?" And he said, "No, we'd have to go as husband and wife." It was suspicious.
Ew.
It was sus.
Weird. Weird with a hard H.
But then she had a dream and heard Rochester's voice and she ran away and all was dandy.
I think one thing that this book did really well, Wuthering Heights, that it addressed was definitely I think Catherine kind of knew overall, not even just for the sense of like societal purposes, but also I think as she got older and she realized who the person Heathcliff was becoming, she was like, ooh, that's not good. So I think it definitely approached topics like toxic relationships or like the more manipulative nature of abuse rather than like physical. So I thought that that was interesting. That didn't seem like that was really written about in that kind of time. Not as directly, I don't think. Like it might have been in the background, but it was more of like the focus of this one. Um,
So
and
like
just revenge too, you know.
I've seen this before on the interwebs, but I had recently read a Jane Austen book and somebody compared it like the Bronte sisters are like the emo version of Jane Austen. And I kind of agree with that. I'm not gonna lie.
I could agree with that. That makes sense. I mean, and that also makes sense too because I mean, just look at like the concept that they had to literally write under male pen names just to be published and taken a little bit more seriously. So imagine like when people were reading this, they're like, "Oh yeah, this man wrote this like really good book that like addresses good issues." Ha, psych! It was a girl.
Why did a
Like,
man writing about governesses this much? Like they were
yeah, it was probably
stupid.
yeah, like
yeah, like why were you falling for that? That they were like these men. Ha ha ha. The Bronte sisters were ahead of their time. They're
so like
like, how can we trick
related
them?
so like related to that, I've been trying to figure out how to word this. Because I put it in the script and it confused Rylee. But Jane Eyre is like noted as like revolutionizing like first person writing And not because it's the first person narrative, but because of like how it was stylized to be really sympathetic toward that main character, and like you've got all of her like inner thoughts and just like idea of self, as like this book is written as though it's Jane writing her autobiography. And so it just really, there's a lot of obviously the world building in there, but there's a lot of also that like internal character building that apparently wasn't very common yet in the writing. And so there's a lot of notes of how Jane Eyre kind of like was the first representation of like the modern idea of self. In like narrative writing. So that's really interesting. As I was like kind of alluding to at the beginning, like I didn't like the characters in this book really, but like the world was extremely built up for the most part. The whole St. John St. John thing happens in like the last 2 hours of the book. Like I feel like that could have been cut. I did listen to the unabridged version, but that definitely happened in the version I read for high school too, and I really doubt I read the unabridged version then. And so that all felt a little rushed, but like up until that point, like you were really getting into like the world that Jane was experiencing and how she was experiencing it and like what her thought processes were and how she was interacting with that space. And so like for that reason, I was like, yeah, I'm giving this at least 4 stars because like the world building, like the character building is all really there. I just personally don't like the story or the characters. And I think that's a question. We all use Storygraph. There's like a question on there that's like, are the characters likable? If I would like actually fill out those surveys, I would have been like, no. But read the book.
I also struggled with that one. I feel like that question on Storygraph about is Agnes Grey likable? I was like, she was a little bit whiny, and then all of her students sucked. But like, I was happy she had a happy ending. Like, so I was like, I don't know. I think I put it's complicated for that one. I don't know. Overall, the book was fine. It was like a 3 out of 5. It was average for me. I give a lot of books threes though, so like I wouldn't not recommend it. I wouldn't necessarily like go out of my way to listen to it or read it again, but it was fine. If you want to read a classic book, this is a nice short one compared to y'all's. So that was cool. What about you, Alexis? What did you think of your book?
Yeah, I'll probably give Wuthering Heights like a 3.5, 4 stars, just because it was entertaining to see like this man Heathcliff just be a freaking mastermind. Like he was really just playing everybody. I honestly felt like I was reading the 1847 version of Saltburn. Like he was really just playing everybody, like through and through to the death. A little weird that this is like the second book in the last 6 months that involved cousins liking each other. My book club from my friends on Bookstagram had us read this like Christmas murder game book, and the like plot twist, spoiler alert, is that the two cousins were like plotting against the family for money and stuff. And I was like, what? Why do y'all in England like your cousins? Is this like like why is this a thing? So for whatever reason this just continued. But like I really don't know how I read this in high school and liked it. Like it was kind of dark. And then I chose to read this again. Like what the heck? But yeah, I mean, I definitely recommend it if you just want to try it one time. Definitely recommend the audiobook versus like the physical copy. Just because the language is so different. But yeah, everybody just in this book was so dramatic. You should read it though, I think. It's long, but
My review of Wuthering Heights is that it was a DNR or DNF, not DNR, LOL. Talking about death a lot this podcast.
they're gonna be like, are these girls okay?
No.
Man, and I was gonna propose for our next episode, maybe we should have a glass of wine or something with it, but like we're not even having a drink with this one. We struggling.
No, but yeah, I did not finish Wuthering Heights and never plan to, so that is my opinion on that book.
Well, I guess that would conclude today's episode. Don't necessarily know how many classic books we'll be reading again for a little while, but if you have any specific classic books for you listeners that you would like us to analyze and give our 2024 synopsis of, feel free to let us know. Um, if you guys have not been caught up on our episodes, we will be returning back to the 21st century for episode 10. And you probably already know what it is if you've been listening, or if you've been following my Bookstagram at Momo's Bookshelf, my shameless plug. If you don't know, I will gladly remind you. Our first double-digit episode, crazy, we will be talking about the book-to-movie comparison of The Idea of You by Robin Lee. The movie airs on Amazon Prime, not sponsored yet, on May 2nd, 2024. It will be starring Anne Hathaway, and of course, like I said, y'all already know, Nicholas Galitzine. I am so excited. I cannot wait. I will be wearing an August Moon shirt.
This is all so wild to me because this book is 100% a One Direction fanfic, and I was deep in that fandom in 2013. So I
can't
am an
confirm
expert on
this.
this space. I will be able to talk on this topic in depth on next month's episode.
I
Alysha
probably will
be
too.
Alysha
Sorry.
will be doing her third what is it called? Dissertation on One Direction.
Urban resilience, Taylor Swift, One Direction. Let's go.
I'll be able to confirm all of this because through proximity of living with her from 2013 on to 2017, woman was crazy.
Can I do a dissertation and get my PhD in Nicholas Galitzine studies? Is that a thing? I petition for that. I'm gonna hit up Purdue.
We're gonna be able to create the department. Bye.
Bye.